can't see the urgency in my breath. Then breathe in unison with me for a moment.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Good Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show. Liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Very, very much appreciated. So yeah, last week, good fun. World Whiskies, always nice to do some weird and wonderful stuff, I suppose. And we're kind of sticking with the World Whisky theme this week. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I was doing some box digging, and God, I tell you what, I am really excited about this week's episode of the show, because I've discovered that I actually had enough samples of Millstone, the Dutch single malt whiskey produced by Dutch whiskey produced by Zuidam distillers in Holland, funnily enough. And I thought, yeah, great, you know, I've been collecting these for some years, it has to be said, and finally got the opportunity or had enough of them together. Most of them come from various World Whiskies Awards, and I think one I reviewed for the Whisky magazine a few years ago, and one came kindly from my good friend Ian Sunderland. Yeah, like I said, I've been a big fan of Millstone for a number of years, tasted no end of their releases, and yeah, I'm really stoked that I can finally do an episode of the show. Now, this will probably be a one and done, because I can't imagine that I will get together another half dozen samples, and unless, of course, Patrick Van Zuidam is watching the show and thinks I've done a good job and kindly send me a load of samples for another episode. Who knows? You know, these things happen, don't they? Anyway, so the distillery itself was kind of founded in 1975 by Fred Van Zuidam. I think I pronounced the name correctly. He was previously sort of master distiller, worked for De Kuiper, which are the, you know, big well-known Dutch distillers, and he decided that, you know, he wanted to do his own thing, so he purchased a plot of land in Baal Nassau and set up a distillery, initially I believe to sort of create the classic Dutch spirits, i.e. sort of Genever, which really intriguing stuff. I mean, I know a lot of you are sort of like not particularly into your sort of gins and white spirits and stuff, but Genever is really intriguing. It's kind of like I wouldn't quite go as far as saying a sort of a bridge style spirit, but being made predominantly from rye, it's got this kind of real oiliness, kind of new makey, kind of whiskey-ish sort of character. Certainly the good ones do, and I mean, certainly when you get I mean, I know that it's obviously got the addition of botanicals and so on and so forth, and a lot of the Dutch Genevers tend to use nuts as one of the botanicals, and so I think they're an intriguing spirit. Obviously, they're not to everybody's taste, but anyway, I'm digressing. So, whiskey production, in actual fact, didn't really start in earnest until 1998, although they did start trials in 1994. And believe it or not, this one, the single cask that was bottled specifically for the Whisky Exchange, actually comes from 1996. So, you know, 2 years before they really sort of kicked off their whiskey production. Back then they had one very small copper pot still and a 300 square meter distillery, so pretty damn small. Nowadays slightly bigger than that. They have 6 stills, 2 8,500 litre, 1 2,000 litre, 1 1,500 litre and 1 850 litre still. Now obviously Zuidam are probably arguably better known for their rye. In actual fact, like I said, you know, they use that for the production of their Genever. Their 100 rye regularly wins best rye in the World Whisky Awards, and they have obviously separate washbacks. They keep the rye separate to the single malt, and I think they're quite a progressive looking distillery. They have a core range, and they do a number of specials like a lot of distilleries do. I've got a few of the specials lined up here in front of me, which should be really intriguing. I know they're sort of looking at, again, heritage varieties of barley and other grains. They're also looking at different styles of yeast as well. So very modern looking, very sort of, you know, I guess sort of forward planning, forward looking kind of distillery, which is really cool. They use a number of different casks, as you probably know. They use American oak, ex-sherry, and so on and so forth. They do peated and unpeated spirit, and I think sort of overall, I hand on my heart, I've not come across a poor bottling of Millstone whatsoever. The Millstone name for their whiskey didn't actually come into, well, they didn't start using that until about 2007, so they've been producing whiskey for quite some time. And this, I guess, is probably one of the things I like about Millstone, or Zuidam, whatever you want to call it, is that it kind of rocked the trend to a certain extent of these European distilleries producing. I mean, yes, they do release young spirit. I mean, I've got one here which is about 4 years old, and they do a 5-year-old peated and so on and so forth. But you know, when the sort of, I wouldn't say craze because that's the wrong kind of word, but when the interest in European distilleries really kicked off a few years back now, Zuidam were in the position that they were already in the market with a lovely mature product, whereas a lot of these other distilleries were essentially playing catch up. You know, they were releasing 3, 4, 5-year-old overly young spirit, in my personal opinion. And yes, all right, there were, as I've said on numerous occasions, there were obviously people that really enjoyed that style of spirit, and a number of those distilleries continue to produce and release youngish sort of spirit. For me personally, I often find it just too young, too fainty, and you know, just not enough maturity for my personal taste anyway. But like I said, you know, Zuidam were already there in the market. They had sort of, you know, some mature stocks of whiskey, and have continued to sort of release that. So I think this is going to be a really intriguing episode of the show. Really excited about this. I don't know whether there have been any other sort of YouTube reviews of Zuidam's whiskey in this kind of format, but I don't know. Anyway, it's not doesn't really matter whether they have or not, because this is a pretty unique episode, I think. So time for me to shut up and introduce along.
We do it together, we don't do it at all.
Okay, so we're going to kick off with one of the aforementioned specials. This is the Dutch 5-grain special number 4, bottled at 46%. And as the title of the whiskey gives the game away, it is indeed produced with a mash bill of 5 grains. So we have wheat, corn, rye, malted barley, and svelte. Interesting. Hopefully that's going to be interesting. So aged in brand new American oak, didn't carry an age statement. Second bottling we're looking at is a 12-year-old sherry cask matured, again bottled at 46%. This was distilled in February of 1999 and bottled in March of 2013. So that sample has been knocking around for a while. Then we're going to move on to the really old one. I mean, look at the colour of that. I mean, it's not quite pitch black, but it's kind of getting there. So this is the 26-year-old, which was bottled exclusively for the Whisky Exchange, distilled in October of 1996, bottled in October of 2022, a single Oloroso cask, 4152, and it was bottled at 42.4%, which I imagine was pretty much what the ABV had dropped to. I'm quite surprised, actually. Well, no, not quite surprised. I mean, it's probably the oldest European whiskey that I've come across, and the climate in Holland is obviously slightly more warmer than it is in Scotland, and I believe the Angel share is roughly about double what you would expect in Scotland, so between 4 and 6%. So yes, I can see a cask lasting for 26 years. Maybe this was an experiment. Maybe they were just doing that to see how long a cask could actually sort of like mature for. But anyway, it was eventually bottled for the Whisky Exchange. Then we're going to move on to the first of 3 peated malts. This is their special number 14, which was a 4-year-old peated malt aged in American oak and Moscatel casks. Single cask. I'm assuming it's a finish. I hadn't really studied that actually, particularly. So casks 17B088, distilled in May of 2013, bottled in May of 2018, which therefore makes it actually a 5-year-old, but they've stated it as a 4-year-old. Something's wrong here somewhere, but anyway, it's a young spirit, shall we say. Anyway, let's move on to the penultimate whisky, which is another special. This is a heavily peated special number 7. It's a 10-year-old, bottled at 46%, distilled in February of 2005, bottled in September of 2015, and I reviewed that for the Whisky magazine's new releases back in February 2016. Wow, where does the time go? Anyway, and on to the final bottling of the day, which is another special. This is special number 11, and it's a Peated PX. I'm assuming, probably refill PX, I imagine. Not sure if it's a finish or wholly aged. I mean, we'll probably figure that one out when we get to it. It's a 6-year-old. It was distilled in October of 2010, bottled in May of 2016, and again bottled at 46%. So yeah, really looking forward to this. It's the first time I've tasted half a dozen bottlings of Millstone in one go, so really looking forward to this. I've tasted them obviously at some point over the years, but never all together, so really looking forward to this. Let's kick off with a bit of 5 grain, shall we? Okay, so let's see what 5 grain gives us on the nose then, shall we? Really intense. Lots of dried fruit, getting plenty of the rye up first in actual fact. Quite sweet rye, sweet oak, touch of coconut, some nougat. There's a wheatiness that's sitting beneath it, that slight sort of creamy kind of cereal note. The svelte, I think, is kind of melding in to a certain extent with the rye notes. I tend to find svelte, although I've not tasted it that often, does tend to have a sort of a dark sort of cereal character, a bit like rye. In actual fact, I think isn't svelte a hybrid of rye or something, isn't it? A cross or something, but that's a lovely nose. It's got that sort of classical dried fruit, sort of rye kind of grain whiskey, rye whiskey kind of characteristic. Yeah, that's got some nice complexity. Let's sort of pass on. Yeah, again, also got a lovely sweetness on the finish. Subtle dried fruit. It's a little bit hot, possibly, right on the very finish, but that's giving it some lovely spiciness. Again, I am getting the rye, I'm getting a lovely sweetness of rye as well. It's got a sort of sweet, bitter rye, svelty kind of character. Don't really get an awful lot of the wheat. There's a sort of maybe a fullness there, which is possibly what the wheat is lending itself to, but I think that's possibly more down to the cask. It's got that sort of classical rye intensity on the mid palate. And like I say, a little hot on the finish, I would say, but you know, nothing to really get bent out of shape about. So yeah, that was a really good start. Okay, so let's move on to the 12-year-old sherry cask matured. So let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Sherry, yeah. Tobacco leaf, prune, sweet sherried dried fruit, sweet grape, and that's pretty much about it. To be honest with you, it's got a level of complexity within the sherry the sherry aromas, but it is pretty much all cask derived. I'm not really getting any barley. I'm certainly not getting anything other than the sherry cask. Let's see what that's like. Sweet, herbal, juicy, plenty of raisinated fruits, touch of sultana, a little bit of bitter chocolate, some tannin kind of coming through on the final, on the finish, a little bit of pecan possibly, bittering quite hard now on the aftertaste, a little bit of licorice, clean, no sulphur, nothing much other than the cherry, it has to be said. So for me, you know what I'm like when it comes to sherry matured whiskies. It's not really completely floating my boat, it has to be said, but can't argue with the quality of the casks anyway. Right, okay, so onto a stonking old single Oloroso cask. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Oh lordy. Cool, where do you start with this? Right, okay, so yes, it's again all about the cask, but, and here we have the but, with regards to sort of old sherry matured whiskies, you start to get the secondary oxidation character, and in essence this is very much like an old Armagnac now. Dark dried fruits, raisin, fig, prune, almond, morello cherries, camphor, green olives almost, walnuts, green wood, dark chocolate. I mean, complexity is off the scale, it has to be said. No spirit character whatsoever, you know, it's just sort of, you know, you could just boil it down to, you know, it's old sherry. There's a lovely creaminess there, there's that sort of pure old sherry, that pure old Oloroso kind of note, and loads of oxidation and loads of dried fruit. I mean, it's frankly stunning. I mean, it really is. And you know, the purist hat to a certain extent goes out the window, because this is really not whiskey anymore as such. You know, we are more in sort of Armagnac kind of territory, and old Armagnac kind of territory, and it is just frankly stunning. Anyway, let's see what that's like. That's got quite a tart mid palate, has to be said. Again, it kicks off with the sort of old sherry notes, so you're getting sort of like prunes, raisins. It's again very Armagnac-y, sort of oxidized apple, dried fruits, licorice, marzipan, old wood, coffee, licorice, and in the mid palate, it's this acidity sort of like just appears almost as if out of nowhere, and it makes your mouth tingle. And I'm getting cherries, sour cherries now, slightly chocolatey on the finish, sort of kind of crushed walnuts, still with that sort of dark raisinated fruit note, oxidized fruit kind of just running all the way through it. I mean, it's stunning. It's not whiskey anymore. It's kind of almost to a certain extent transcended whiskey, and it has almost become as complex as an old Armagnac, and it is frankly amazing. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 4 or possibly 5-year-old peated American Oak and Moscatel Special number 14. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Oof, that's interesting. Really estery. Now I know that they do quite a long fermentation. I can't remember the exact length of time. I think it's almost something as mad as kind of 10 days. So you would expect a quite estery, fruity new make spirit. I mean, obviously I haven't got any new make here, unfortunately, so I can't say whether that's true or not, but wow, that's fruity. I mean, that is kind of juicy, pineapple, banana, apricot, peach. There's a little bit of the Madeira note coming in, but I'm not getting a huge amount of that slightly biscuity character. I'm not getting a huge amount of peat either, so very lightly peated. A little bit of vanilla, some cinnamon. That's a gorgeous nose. I mean, that's exuberant. I mean, it's fruity, juicy. Some people might find the sort of, you know, the overt esteriness slightly bubblegummy, slightly confected. I think it's just on the right side of that, personally. I'm getting a little bit more peat as it's kind of sat in the glass. It's a sort of, it's a very light, dusty, almost kind of crumbly peat note. So that's right. Not quite so estery and bubblegummy on the palate. A little bit more of the cask, a little bit more of that sort of winey Moscatel character, light Moscatel, not as biscuity as you would normally expect. There's quite a lot of American oak as well, quite creamy. There is still some estery fruit there. It's still got notes of apple, apricot, pineapple, a little bit of wood spice. Lovely tingling, mouth tingling finish, it has to be said. Wonderfully vibrant. I mean, that's a beautiful whiskey, it has to be said. And not overly peated, again lightly peated, and to be honest with you can almost miss the peat. It's that juicy, that fruity. Does come through on the aftertaste. I'm getting that kind of woodiness now, sort of dry wood, dry sort of dusty peat. Beautiful, stunning whiskey, it has to be said. 4, 5 years old, who cares? It's bloody good.
I can feel a change in me and I want to.
Right, okay, so let's move on to the special number 7. So this is the heavily peated. I see what the cask is. Don't know what the cask is. Let's have a look. Oh yes, that's a nice nose. That's herbal, malty, almost medicinal peat. Touch of treacle, possibly some sherry cask here, dried sultana, wood. It's a chunky nose, it really is. There's again a lovely fruitiness. We're not talking quite the estery level of the previous bottling. It's possible that the more heavier peat has kind of just put the sort of taken the edge off the overt fruitiness of the spirit, or it's possible that they may well have tweaked fermentation of this. Maybe they use different yeast to sort of maybe not get such a fruity estery style, because they wanted sort of, you know, more emphasis on the peat and less about the fruitiness of the spirit. I don't know, but certainly works really well. I mean, that's a lovely nose. Let's see what pass by. A little bit more cask on the palate, it has to be said, a little bit more dried fruit. I'm guessing some sherry cask here, might be a vatting, might be refill sherry, but there's certainly more sherry dried fruit. There's a little bit more treacle. It's not dark and treacly, it's got that sort of lightness to it, which is quite nice. Quite peated. Again, slightly medicinal on the finish. Maybe this is maybe they used Scottish peat, possibly. Lovely citric note, again vibrant, lovely finish, quite malty, full. Still, you know, the fruit is there. It's a lovely whiskey at the end of the day, and it's kind of got that slightly sort of Scottish kind of feel, but it doesn't have a Scottish kind of feel, if you see what I mean. Either way, that's pretty Okay, so moving on to the final whisky of the afternoon. This is the special number 11, so this is a 6-year-old Peated PX. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Again, really quite dense, more malty. This is possibly the maltiest of the spirits that I've come across. Quite coffeed, woody. Again, not hugely peated, a wisp of smoke. A little bit of vanilla, dark honey. If this was a PX cask solely, then it's, I would say, very refilled, because it's actually pretty well balanced. I'm getting some barley notes. I'm getting a little bit of almost estery fruit, but that's very subtle. That's down in the mix, but it is there, and so the balance to me is just about right. And you know, it's not, like I say, it's not, as you can see from the colour, not sort of a huge dark PX treacle laden sherry monster. There's subtlety and nuance here, which is just what I look for with regards to the use of sherry. Let's see what that's like. Bit more heavier on the PX on the palate, but again, it's not particularly dark for a PX matured whiskey. I'd expect more sort of like, you know, the usual treacly kind of like dark prune, that kind of thing. It's actually more in the lighter end of the sort of dried fruit kind of spectrum. So we are, although there's a little bit of raisins, there's more sultanas and dried citrus. There's a little bit of green pepper. Again, the peat is relatively soft, relatively subtle. There's a little bit of almost medicinal notes, but not quite. Again, it's kind of the similar kind of sort of peat profile to the 4 or 5 year old, in that it's got a more drier, kind of dustier sort of peat character. Lovely length. Again, really quite robust, quite malty, quite full. Still some fruit notes there. Really nicely balanced, great length. Yeah, I like that. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Oh well, I thought it was absolutely amazing. I mean, Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. I think we can conclude that Zuidam make bloody good whiskey at the end of the day, and yeah, okay, there's a couple that maybe weren't to my palate. The quality was just stunning, and you can see why they win awards. The whiskey is just bloody good. I like the 5 grain. It actually, I mean, I did read my notes on this when I tasted it the first time round, and I don't think originally, don't think I gave it the credit that it really deserved. I think part of the problem is that when you're sort of judging a number of sort of spirits all together, you kind of sometimes miss things, and I don't think my tasting notes really kind of reflected how complex this particular spirit was. And certainly, although maybe I didn't get a huge amount of the wheat character, I got the sort of sensation of wheat, the creaminess. Certainly it had a lot more rye character. Yeah, maybe the svelte was kind of mingled in there. Possibly the oak was maybe a little bit heavy, but overall I thought that was a really intriguing whiskey, and obviously an experiment. Maybe they'll do it again, but yeah, really intriguing. 12-year-old sherry matured. Like I said, you know me and sherry, it really has to be something pretty bloody amazing, that the 26-year-old for me to basically sort of, you know, go gaga over a sherry cask. The 12-year-old was just very much all about the sherry. There wasn't really a great deal of nuance or light and shade about that particular bottling. It was sherry. Yeah, and there are people that love it. For me, I found it rather, you know. Anyway, but on the other hand, the old sherry, I mean, it's kind of, I'm almost kind of contradicting myself insofar that, yes, it's still all about the sherry, but you're now chucking in the sort of like the aging and the oxidation and where you kind of like, to be honest, where the 12-year-old was rather simplistic. I mean, although there was some complexity within the sherry notes, it was still on the whole fairly simplistic. With the 26-year-old, you're chucking in the age, you're chucking in the oxidation, and now we're suddenly in a completely different ballpark. You know, yeah, okay, there's no distillery characters, almost no spirit character per se. But we are getting a lot more complexity and a lot more interest and a lot more pennies to have to spend on it, it has to be said. So, yeah, absolutely stunning. The peated American Oak and Moscatel, lovely whiskey, however old it actually really is. Just subtle Moscatel, more grapey, more winey Moscatel, as opposed to the sort of biscuity Moscatel that I normally tend to, or the characteristic I normally associate with Moscatel finished whiskey. Even so, just a smidge of peat. It was just beautifully balanced, really complex, very, very harmonious. The heavily peated, yeah, again, really great whiskey, loved it. Not OTT on the peat. Yes, the peat is obviously there and more noticeable, and there is a slight medicinally kind of note, and it does kind of make it feel a little bit more Scottish in character as opposed to Dutch. But you could argue that what is Dutch whiskey? Dutch whiskey is really sort of, you know, the first one in reality, the use of rye really. But as a whiskey in its own right, ignoring where it comes from and all that kind of stuff, absolutely gorgeous. And the final whiskey, the Peated PX, again, you know, just really nicely balanced, really harmonious, guessing refill PX cask, so not overwhelming the spirit. It's young, but it's perfectly, it's not fainty, it's not sort of, and that is the key part of sort of, although some of their releases are relatively young, 5-6 years of old, they are ready for drinking. They're not sort of, you know, you don't get the feel they've been released because they had to, should we say, that they're released because they wanted to at the end of the day. So, and that to me is completely, two completely different things. So, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the show, something a little bit different, probably not to be repeated again, but wow, what a lineup. So all I have to say is good afternoon and good dramming. No, it's not quite afternoon yet. Ooh, brew for breakfast.